And the next thing we want to do is we'd like to get started by going into our model file, which is dog.js, and we'll just start writing out the code to create a new backbone model. So I'm going to go into the models folder here and double click on dog.js. Now what we're going to do here is construct a backbone model, and much in the same way that we can create constructor functions using just core JavaScript, we can also use Backbone to create constructors. So for example, here's how a constructor looks in core JavaScript. You could do something like function dog, like this. And then if you wanted to create a new dog, you could say something like var dog equals a new instance of the dog function, just like this. Now in Backbone, we essentially create a constructor, but we give it more features and all the benefits of the code that's been written into the Backbone library. All of the conveniences of having defaults, being able to get and set values safely, being able to easily associate models with views or collections, and also being able to easily associate model instances and sync them with a database, which we'll talk about in upcoming videos. So instead of creating a function dog with a capital D, I'll actually use the Backbone library to create this constructor. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to say dog equals backbone.model.extend. Okay. And then as an option here to the extend method, we are able to pass in our own changes by passing in an object like this. So we just put curly braces inside there and open it up. And we're going to start by setting the initialize method on this model. So initialize is a function that runs whenever new instances of this dog are created. So any code I put inside of here will run automatically whenever a new instance of the dog is created. Okay. So down here we're going to say that immediately whenever a new dog is created, we'll create a new view to be associated with that dog. So we'll just go ahead and say this.view, this referring to the instance of dog that's just been created or initialized, and to the view property. So we'll set this equal to a new dog view, which we haven't written this Backbone view yet, but we'll do that coming up soon. And when we create a new dog view, we will set a property on that view called model, and it will point back to this particular model. So essentially what we're doing is whenever we create a new instance of a dog, we're automatically creating a new view for it, and we're storing that new view in a property called view for this instance. So if we create 5, 10, 20 dogs, they're each going to have their own unique view. Okay. And when we create the new view, we also simultaneously set the view with a property called model that's going to point back to this particular instance of a dog. Okay. The other thing that we want to happen is whenever there are changes on this model, on this dog model, we want the view to update itself. So I'm going to call this.on, and on will look for different events to occur, and we can pass this a string for the particular event that we would like it to trigger a callback function on. So I'm going to go ahead and say anytime there is a change on the name property, I want you to run this function. Okay. So inside of this function, we will just say this.view, which remember is referring to the new instance of a dog view, and we'll call .render on it. Okay, so we're going to write a method called render on the dog view so that whenever there are a change to the name of the dog, it will then re-render the view showing that change. Okay. Cool. So then down here, in order to create a new instance of a dog, we can just say var dog equals new dog, just in the same way we would if this were a typical core JavaScript constructor function, right? But now it is so much more powerful than just a JavaScript constructor function. It's actually now a constructor function that is inheriting from the backbone model object, which has all of these neat baked-in features, such as the initialize method that calls code when it, immediately runs. And we'll, coming up, we'll look at many more different things you can add into the model. Okay, so this is good for now for our backbone model. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and then I'm going to jump over to my views. So inside the views folder, I have dogview.js. So to create a new dog view, we'll go ahead and say dog view equals a backbone.view, and then we'll call .extend. All right, and then we'll put in curly braces to pass in as an argument an object of the things we'd like to alter. So the first thing we want to do is we want to associate this view with a particular element in the HTML page. So I'm going to associate it with this div with the ID of dog. So we'll go ahead and say EL for element, and this is a property that we're given automatically with views. And I'm going to go ahead and set this guy to an element with the pound symbol dog. That means the ID of dog. Okay. And we'll go ahead and create a couple more properties here. We'll create one called events, and events is equal to an object. And here what we can do is we can pass in particular events such as hover and click, any sort of user event on a particular element. So in this case, we want to listen for click events on this set button right here. So in order to do that, we can say click and then a space, and then we'll just say pound set. Okay, and then it will be listening for clicks on these, in an element with the ID of set that is inside of the element that has an ID of dog. So all of these things here in the event string are all sort of in relationship to the element that's associated with this view. So this is looking for clicks on something with an ID of set that's inside of the element with the ID of dog. Okay, and we will set this property essentially to hold a string, which is the name of the function we'd like to call whenever set is clicked. So I'm just gonna say that this will call a function called setName, just like that. And then we'll actually create that function here by saying setName is a function. And we'll go ahead and say that whenever we click setName, we will create a variable called name, and we'll go ahead and have jQuery select the input with the ID of name, which is right here. This is the input type text ID name. So we're going to go ahead and select that and call .val on it to get the value out of it. So we're grabbing the value that they type into name. All right. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say this.model, which is the model associated with this view, right? And if you remember, this model property gets set when we first created the dog model, because whenever a new instance of a dog is created, the initialize method ensures that this code here will run whenever a new dog is created, or in other words, whenever a new dog is initialized. And what we did is we set the view on that dog instance, dog.view, to be equal to a new dog view, and we passed in the model as this. So we set the model of the dog view to this, which is this instance of the dog, right? So it knows what model is. Model on a view is this model, the dog that we just created. So here, this dot model dot set. So set allows us to change things on a model, and we want to pass in an object here, and we want to say we want to set name to this variable here, name. So we're setting the name property on the model to the value of the name that they typed in here. So let's go ahead and look at everything that's happening here before we move any further. So we basically set up a dog view to be an extension of the backbone view object, and we told it that its element should be pointing toward the div with the ID of dog, and we set up essentially an events object where it will be looking for clicks on a button with the ID of set that is inside of the dog element. And whenever we do see a click on this set button, it's going to call the set name function, which is right here. When it calls the set name function, it's going to create a variable called name and grab the value out of the form input with the ID of name. And then we're going to set the model associated with this view to have its name property change to the name that the person typed into that form input. So there's just one last thing we want to do here, which is we want to create another function here called render. So we're going to say render is equal to a function. And what we want to do is we want to essentially select the element that belongs to this view, and we want to swap out the contents of that element with just simply the dog's name that has been set, right? The new name that's been set on this model. So what we want to do is refer to the dog element, and we want to use jQuery to select this dog element. So the way we do this is we say this.el. So this.el refers to this element, which is the ID of dog. And a neat trick that comes baked into Backbone is if we put a $ on the front of el, this will actually have jQuery select this element for us. So now this is a jQuery selection of this element, which is the ID of dog right here, this whole div. Okay. And what we want to do then is call .html to replace the HTML inside of that element. And what we'd like to do is replace the HTML. Currently it's like a form where you type in a name and click set. And we're just going to replace that out with the name of the particular dog that we just changed. So we're going to call this.model to refer to the model associated with this view, and we're going to say .get, and we're going to get the name attribute, and that's going to get passed in here. The name, which is a string, that's going to get passed into the HTML method, which is a jQuery method for replacing the HTML content of this.el, which is a selection of the element associated with this view. Okay. So you'll see if we go back to dog.js, which is the model, the dog model, that anytime we change the name, it's going to call this.view or the view associated with this dog instance and call render on it. So it's automatically going to render, which we'll call this, and then that will render the model's name. Okay. So you can see that this dog model is pretty well tied to the dog view. And these are actually separate objects, so I can change them and update them. And they're just pointing to or referencing the other one, but they're not directly entangled. They're not the same object. They're two separate objects. And dog here is handling all of the data for the application, which is instances of a dog. And view is handling, like click events and changing the name, which is then, telling the model to update itself. And then when the model sees that it is changed, it will then tell the view to update itself. And then the view will update showing the new name on the model. Okay. So next thing we want to do is we want to kind of fire off all of this stuff to run. So I'm actually going to go back to my dog model, and I'm going to pull out this line 10 here, where I was demonstrating how you create a new instance of the dog. And we actually want this to be kind of the thing that starts off our application. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out of there, Command X, and then we're going to save that and go back to app.js. So I'm going to double click on app.js. And since we're using jQuery, I'm going to take advantage of the document ready that's built in jQuery. So this is just the shorthand for creating a document ready in jQuery, essentially making sure that the DOM is fully loaded. And then once the DOM is loaded, we will create a new instance of a dog. Okay, so upon creating a new instance of a dog, the dog model here is going to, upon initialization, create a view and pass itself in as a model associated with that view, right? And then the view is going to listen for clicks on set name, and at which point it will grab the value of name and tell the model to set itself with a new name. Now when the model changes the name, it's going to tell the view to render, and then the view is going to update the DOM to essentially replace the form with just the name that's been set for that dog. So let's go ahead and bring this guy up in the browser and test it out. So I'm going to go back to the index.html page. I'm just going to control click and say open in browser, and we'll bring this guy up in Chrome. So here we can see our view, which is the div with the ID of dog. And for the name, I'm going to say Fido Roxy the third is the full name of our dog. And then I'm going to click set name, and that changed the view here to the name of this particular dog. Let's go ahead and call get status, see what changed here. It looks like quite a few things. We've updated the readme, the index. So I'm just going to go ahead and call get add dot to add all the files. We're going to call get commit -m, and we'll put in a message of add dog model and dog view. Okay, and we'll go ahead and push this guy up to origin master. Okay, there we go. So next, let's go ahead and jump back into the slides, and we're going to discuss in greater detail the different components of Backbone one by one. So we'll go back in and discuss models in full detail. Then we'll talk about collections and views and routers.